Greetings. This lecture is entitled The 30 Years' War, French Revolution, and Christianity. It focuses on the interaction of war, politics, and Christianity in Europe. The first part is on the 30 Years' War of the 17th century, referred to as, quote, last of the so-called wars of religion. The second part covers what took place in the following century in France, whereas the 30 Years' War witnessed conflict between different religious expressions, primarily Protestants, mostly Calvinists, against Catholics. The French Revolution was the state with its radical ideology clashing with Roman Catholicism. Fought in the years 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War was the last of the so-called wars of religion. The war was fought mostly on German soil, but there were important battles in France, the Spanish Netherlands, the United Provinces, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The war involved at least 17 sovereign powers. The Habsburg dynasty, particularly the Austria and Spain branches, fought the German Protestant princes and their allies, which included Protestants of Denmark, Sweden, and the United Provinces, and interestingly, Catholics of France. The Habsburgs represented a strong Central European empire backed by the Roman Catholic Church. Their Protestant opponent fought to preserve the autonomy of the states composing the Holy Roman Empire. In essence, they fought for political and religious reasons. The war went through various phases before it was settled in 1648 by the Peace of Westphalia. In 1618, a Catholic prince took control of Bohemia. This is the modern Czechoslovakia. So the prince took control with the aim of pushing aside the substantial Protestant minority of Calvinists. Protestant nobles did not accept this action without a fight. At Prague, the Protestant nobles threw the prince's representatives out the castle window. Because these Catholics landed in a pile of manure, they survived the fall. The Catholic explanation was that it was angels that saved them from this fall. Getting rid of the bureaucrats did not solve the conflict. The Holy Roman Empire political structure consisted of near equal number of Catholic and Protestant electors. These were princes who elected the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg established the Lutheran Church as a legitimate alternative to Catholicism in Germany. With this treaty, a prince could define his principality as either Catholic or Lutheran. As for Bohemia, early in the next century, whoever controlled Bohemia, either a Catholic or a Protestant prince, might alter the balance of power. The ruling Catholic Habsburgs of the Holy Roman Empire feared a Protestant controlling Bohemia. The Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, educated by the Jesuits, sought to reclaim Bohemia for Catholicism. This action provoked Protestant princes in Germany who rejected the authority of the emperor. So when we speak of the Protestants, we're either talking about the Calvinists or Lutherans. Protestants fought hard, but soldiers fighting for Emperor Ferdinand and Roman Catholicism experienced greater success in the first 12 years of the conflict. The first major battle over the Bohemians took place in 1620 at the Battle of White Mountain, located northwest of Prague. The army of the powerful Catholic Maximilian of Bavaria was too formidable. From Austria, an imperial army of 25,000 entered Bohemia, defeated the Protestants, and occupied Prague. Catholicism was restored, images were replaced in the churches, the Jesuits called in, and no religion was to be allowed except Catholicism and Judaism. But this victory that killed or exiled many Protestants did not stop the Protestant struggle. In 1624, a Bohemian nobleman named Albert von Wallenstein began to raise another army to assist the Holy Roman Emperor. Within 3 years, this army controlled the northern region of the empire, which had been a Protestant stronghold. In 1629, the confident Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution, which ordered all territories lost to Protestants since 1552 be restored to Catholics. There was widespread opposition to the edict, but it was enforced. The tide began to turn more favorable to Protestants when they received support from abroad. At this stage, the war became more political and confusing. For example, in one case, there were French Catholics in opposition to other Catholics. The Catholic French king threw his support behind the Protestants to weaken the power of the Habsburgs. Support also came from Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus. Adolphus feared a Habsburg retreat to Swedish lands near the Baltic Sea. For him, the best defense against the Catholic Habsburg threat was to establish Swedish bastions on the mainland. Adolphus had approximately 40,000 men, well-trained, armed with, quote, the new style flintlock, not the old matchlock muskets, and trained to move swiftly with their light artillery. His soldiers loved him. German armies had scores of prostitutes following them ready to entertain the men, but Adolphus allowed no such thing in his camps. In fact, twice a day, each regiment attended prayer, and every Sunday they heard sermons. The Swedish king met Wallenstein's army at Lutzen in 1632. Adolphus had 25,000 men, and the Catholic Wallenstein had 40,000 men. But the Swedes prevailed against the Catholics, however, at a huge price. To bolster the center of his forces, Adolphus put himself at the head of a regiment of cavalry and led a risky rally. He took a bullet in the arm and back, and his horse fell. Catholic soldiers closed around him and demanded his identity. He answered, quote, I am the king of Sweden who do seal the religion and liberty of the German nation with my blood. They drove swords again and again into his body. As for Wallenstein, Emperor Ferdinand had him assassinated a few months later, believing he was plotting to become king of Bohemia. The next phase of the war was from 1632 to 1648, when the Catholics lost most of the earlier gains. As Protestants gained strength, Ferdinand was pressured to suspend the Edict of Restitution and grant amnesty to many of the Protestant princes. With this new policy, Ferdinand sought the assistance of Protestants to join the imperial army and force Swedish troops out of German lands. Complicating things further were the French, who believed that the Habsburgs were becoming too strong for the good of France and the freedom of the papacy. Consequently, Swedish and French troops carried out military engagements that weakened the Holy Roman Empire. Armies laid waste to numerous towns and villages before the war reached a stalemate and both sides ceased fighting. Estimates suggest the population of Germany decreased by 30%. 6 armies fought in Germany: German, Danish, Swedish, Bohemian, Spanish, and French. These armies were manned mostly by mercenaries or foreigners who had no attachment to the German people or soil or history. For the right price, they fought for anyone. The armies fed themselves by plundering grains, fruit, and livestock. There was much killing of innocents and widespread rape. Morals and morale collapsed, and the fatalism of despair invited the cynicism of brutality. As for a Christian understanding of the war, some Christian writers of the day turned to the Old Testament for explanation. In his article, Jeremiah in the Village, Prophecy, Preaching, and Pamphlets, the Penance in the 30 Years' War, John Thibault suggests that Lutherans made sense of the destructive war by seeing themselves in the metaphor of the chastened Israelites of the Old Testament. And the quote continues, "War and the devastation that war unleashed was God's punishment of Germany's sins." And it was, quote, "the prophecies of Jeremiah that figured most prominently in commentaries on the war. Jeremiah, especially in conjunction with the separate lamentations of Jeremiah, was the most extensive and consistent exposition of how God punishes those who deviate from his commandments. It provided a wealth of examples of the kinds of punishments that could be inflicted, which were then applied to specific events in the war. Complaints about the sinfulness of the community and God's righteous anger belonged to a genre, the Jeremiad, that was defined expression throughout the war." End of quote. Germany had experienced major destruction. Spain went bankrupt. Only France and Sweden emerged somewhat victoriously. The Peace of Westphalia, named after a region in Germany, allowed German princes to decide their own religion, and Calvinism became one of the tolerated faith. It also signaled the end of the religious wars in Europe. There was the recognition of religious differences. A pious and literate shoemaker, Hans Herbel, wrote in 1649, quote, "This war, 1649, is a blessed, predestined year of jubilation and joy. Although peace was made in the year 1648, that peace was not fully completed. But praise God alone on highest. Now there is peace on earth in our Germany and in the entire Roman Empire, among the emperor, Sweden, France, and all kings, counts, and towns, as well as villages, markets, settlements, manors, and enod, rich and poor, young and old, man and woman, wife and child, in sum, The dear animals and horses can be pleased with all and enjoy peace. End of quote. In the case of the French Revolution, 150 years later, Roman Catholics did not face opposing Calvinists of any Protestants. Instead, Catholics of both noble and peasant origins encountered a dangerous ideology that brought much evil to France. While it is true that Enlightenment intellectuals promoted a dangerous message that they were, rather than pious Christians, the true purveyors of light and learning, how was it possible that a state could turn against a Catholic society and seek to de-Christianize an entire culture? What is to be said of the rise of modern paganism? In the late 1700s, France was in an economic mess and political leaders demanded action. In 1789, elected deputies throughout France arrived at Versailles at the beginning of May. The opening session of the Estates General, which was an old form of government, took place in a great hall. But the Estates General was unable to solve France's financial and taxation mess. There was a deadlock by order versus by head. Eventually, the third estate chose to hold its own meetings. So you had three estates. The Estates General was three states. The third estate decided to go out on its own, and it was joined by some sympathetic clergy. On June 17, it changed its name to the National Assembly as an assertion of its true representation of the French nation. When members of the National Assembly were locked out of their meeting hall 3 days later, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court where they vowed to stay together for the purpose of writing a constitution. And in the painting there, we see that this is the actual indoor tennis court. King Louis XVI refused to accept the now popularly supported National Assembly as a legitimate body. On July 14th, 1789, angry citizens of Paris stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a royal armory that also served as a prison for debtors. The revolution had begun. An angry mob also forced the king and royal family to leave Versailles for Paris in October 1789. The National Assembly introduced important reforms on August 4th that abolished the feudal system, removed the tax exemptions of the nobility and the clergy, and allowed for any citizen to seek office in politics and the military. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen furthered the importance of liberty, and that is liberty and equality before the law for all. At this point, except for the taxation issue, there was no direct attack on the Catholic faith. This would change shortly, however, a point I will return to shortly. The final version of the Constitution passed on September 1791 and turned France into a constitutional monarchy with a ministerial executive power answerable to a legislative assembly. The French had rejected absolutism. King Louis XVI appeared to have accepted the new constitution, but the following year he unsuccessfully tried to escape from France to join foreign forces opposing the revolution. Louis XVI was imprisoned and then executed by way of the guillotine in early 1793. From this point, evil forces were obvious. The new instrument of death became the center of the spectacle of revolutionary justice. In the name of the revolution, The guillotine, referred to as the axe of the people, dispatched over 50,000 victims. The second phase of the revolution that had began in 1792, that began in 1792, promoted equality as its rallying cry. In September, the monarchy was replaced with a republic, and the idea of power being held by the people and their elected representatives. The two major political factions were the Jacobins, who were located on the left wing, the left side of the, when they met to do their politics, and the Girondins were on the right side. So this is where we have the origin of the leftist versus right, left versus right politically. Maximilian Robespierre joined the left, the Jacobins, and quickly rose to become the leader. He engineered the Jacobin replacement of the Girondins as leaders of the government. Robespierre orchestrated the Reign of Terror, which was a period of systematic state repression. He stated, quote, "To punish the enemies of the fatherland, we must find out who they are, but we do not want to punish them. We want to destroy them." In this dark hour, evil ruled France. The terror was government by fear, which Robespierre theorized as government by virtue. Quote, "If the Republic of free citizens was not a possibility, it must be because certain individuals corrupted by their past history were not yet pure enough." Terror became the means by which revolution, the history yet to be created, would forge the new human beings of the future. End of quote. Using the terror, Robespierre eliminated his armed enemies who posed a threat to his control. But eventually, this radical, this revolutionary, this, again, representing the party on the left, the political, he himself was guillotined. As for Christianity, when the revolution began in 1789, Catholicism was the official religion of France. Protestants and Jews were denied full membership of the state. The French Catholic Church recognized the authority of the Pope as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, but the French had negotiated a greater degree of authority for the French monarchy than was the case for other nations. Even though France was almost entirely Catholic, historians disagree on the strength of the Catholic faith throughout France. Some argue there was steady growth since the reforms of the Council of Trent, and that goes back to the 1500s, whereas others see decline in the 1700s. All historians agree that the church received continued attacks by intellectuals of the Enlightenment. In the late 1700s, one writer complained that Paris was full of priests and tonsured clerics who served neither the church nor the state. The intellectuals argued that trifling matters occupied a priest's time. Philosophers, those who discussed Enlightenment ideas, saw days spent praying as a waste of time. They had no tolerance for people spending their time praying. Such criticism generated further anti-clericalism from others. Another target of criticism was church wealth. When the revolution began, the church owed approximately 6% of land throughout France. There were calls for a reduction of church property and reform or abolition of the tithe. Then this was considered about 1/10 of agricultural production. Under pressure, the church in August 1789 gave up the tithe and control of its funding. When the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was adopted in 1789, absent was any, quote, recognition of the special position of the Catholic Church. By November, the National Assembly placed all church property at the disposition of the nation. In February following year, 1790, the state closed France's monasteries with the plan to sell them and their contents. Christianity had been protected since Constantinople in the early 4th century. So since Constantine, this was over. The government decided what type of Christianity was suitable. The government introduced the civil constitution of the clergy, which stated that priests and bishops were to be elected by citizens and paid by the state using a new salary scale. In the face of some opposition, the state decreed that the clergy take a public oath of loyalty to the Constitution. Failure to comply with the state meant no salary or position. The Pope condemned the oath. Priests' response to the oath was split. About half of the priests compromised and took the deal, and they became known as the constitutional priests, while the other half who refused, they became known as the refractory priests. So the refractory priests refused to choose loyalty to the revolution over Christian faith. Many priests left France, and while residing in other lands, they criticized the revolution. The refractory priests who stayed, and that is initially they were allowed to practice, were accused of teaching false principles, and they eventually lost the use of religious buildings. By August 1792, these priests were ordered to leave France or be arrested. French officials feared the priests were supporting enemy forces. When Austrian forces captured Verdun, hundreds of priests were killed by the French. From this point on, any priest, including the compromising constitutional priests, any priest who preached faced arrest or deportation. The state demanded that the church be silenced. French leaders sought to de-Christianize France in other ways. They introduced a new calendar devoid of a Lord's Day. A holiday was every 10 days rather than 7 days. They planned ceremonies and festivals that made religion of the revolution itself. In 1794, leaders introduced the cult of the supreme being. In essence, a government religion. So clearly we have an episode of the rise of modern paganism. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was renamed. The new name, the Temple of Reason. There was no recognition of God, but instead the worship of the goddess of reason. The state also decreed the closing of churches throughout France. Church bells were melted. If churches were not torn down, they became barns and warehouses. Various decrees banned, quote, outward signs of religion such as statues or religious dress from the public eye. In addition, many clergy and faithful Catholics were persecuted. Most priests and nuns died by more priests and nuns died by the command of radicals. Streets and other public sites named after saints were changed. It was important to wipe out any memory of Christianity. The message was that Christianity had no place in the Republic run by radical elites. As bad as it was, even during the high tide of the terror, quote, with most of the clergy in hiding and all the churches closed, French laymen and women undertook a religious education, continued to baptize their newborns, celebrate unconsecrated or white masses, and bought Catholicism and rituals in numbers that appalled the Parisian police, end of quote. So the elites, those on the left, the Jacobins, the radicals, they wanted to wipe out Christianity, but this was something that was impossible to do. So people still continued to carry on their religious ways. There was some Christian revival in the late 1790s when Napoleon rose. He formed new relations with the church. In July 1801, the Concordat was signed, which recognized Catholicism as the religion of the people, but it did not give the church any privileged place in the state. In fact, the document put the church under the authority of the state. When Napoleon occupied Italy in 1808, the Pope excommunicated him. In response, Napoleon imprisoned the Pope in France until 1814. The French Revolution had forced Christians to worship privately as France and parts of Europe experienced secularization. But modern paganism could not extinguish Christianity. As apologist René de Chateaubriand argued in 1802, quote, Christianity was true because it was beautiful. The 30 Years' War saw Christians killing each other in the last religious war in Europe. But at least in the end, there was the recognition that religious differences you did not have to have war, excuse me. It was not reason for war that there were religious differences. There were no more religious wars in Europe. The French Revolution was the French Revolution was the killing of Christians by atheists, by those radicals on the left in France, on the political left. The Enlightenment saw intellectuals reject the Bible and the deity of Jesus Christ. Of course, there were things to criticize about the Roman Catholic Church. Many of the church leaders came from upper classes and they failed to appreciate the difficult lives of the French peasants. There was also the poor treatment of others. Protestants in other countries pointed to the consequences of the French ruling class persecuting the Huguenots, who were the French Protestants. Although impossible to measure, the banishment of French Protestants from France did influence religiosity in France. There would be no Protestant leaders to confront the anti-Christianity of the modern pagan French state. In the end, the state chose modernist ideas that saw no place for traditional Christianity in society. The French Revolution was a dark time. Thank you.